We'll just go ahead and jump in. This is on the political economy of conservation with my fantastic co-authors, including Robin, who is here. We have a sort of early set of results, all preliminary, and this is sort of a first attempt to pull the pieces together. We're excited to see what you think. This is a project about conservation, about forest conservation, which is going to be important as we move forward for protecting many of our major carbon stocks around the world. Carbon stocks like those in the Amazon, in the Congo, and in Southeast Asia, the three largest, most important, most carbon-rich tropical rainforest systems in the world. But as we push on conservation and conservation policy, we see in Brazil, for example, political challenges. We see this lobbying from agribusiness and big agricultural producers. We see it also in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia and Malaysia, where it is the palm oil lobby that is pushing back. And so in this paper, we're guided by this question of how we can think about and design and evaluate environmental regulation with these kinds of political considerations and this kind of political resistance in mind. And so we'll have a few pieces in this paper that I'll touch on today. In this paper, we're first going to start out showing you empirically that this resistance to environmental regulation by producers, by agricultural producers, is there in the data in Brazil, where the PPCDAM program increased enforcement starting in 2005. And through individual level and firm level campaign donation data, we see empirically that big agricultural producers increased their campaign donations, tilting towards pro-agricultural candidates. Producers resist environmental regulation in the form of campaign donations. And then we'll have a very simple theory, and I'll show you a very simple boiled down numerical example to conceptualize a little bit how we can think about regulation that can account for producer losses, where we're going to note in the kind of canonical sense that Pigouvian taxes, of course, are first best in the sense that they minimize welfare losses from abatement. But we note that these are utilitarian aggregate welfare losses that rely on transfers to make everyone whole and to have us win out in total. But we're going to note that in a political economy setting where the salience of producer losses and producer profit losses is going to lead to resistance from producers, we may want to think about aggregate second best policies with this minimization of producer losses in mind. We're going to show you that bans are one form of regulation that can do that. Bans are, of course, coarser than taxes. They're a zero tax below a cutoff, an infinite tax above a cutoff, but they will be better at minimizing producer losses, even as they are not as good at minimizing aggregate welfare losses. So simple conceptual point, ultimately, but one that we're going to, again, take to the data. Right now, we go to a different empirical setting, actually. We show in Indonesia with a simple land use model that allows us to quantitatively simulate taxes and bans, by the way, being the modal form of regulation in this particular setting in Indonesia. We're going to show you quantitatively that in terms of abatement and emissions reductions, actually bans are about as effective as taxes. But from the perspective of producers who have producer profit losses in mind, bans are better. They're half as costly. That's where we're going to go.
Just as a background point, Marty Weitzman 50 years ago had a paper called Prices versus Quantities, where he pointed out that the case for taxes is not always clear cut, depends on what the uncertainty is about, whether the uncertainty is about the slope of the thing you're affecting by taxes or not. I mean, maybe orthogonal to what you're doing, but somehow people seem to forget that when they always assert that Pigouvian taxes are better than quantity restrictions, which was what he pointed out is incorrect in that famous paper.
Absolutely, totally agreed. We're going to show in a setting with even without uncertainty, but by appealing to this sort of political economy of the incidence of regulatory burden that we can say something similar. Please.
This is taxes to cut trees, so it's.
This is taxes on the trees that you cut in order to clear the land for agricultural production. So the Pigouvian tax here is going to be, this plot of land has 10 trees and you cut it down. Why do you cut it down? Because you want the land, you want to clear the land for agricultural production. The Pigouvian tax is that as the land clearer and deforester, you need to pay for all 10 trees. Relative to this other plot with only one tree, you just pay for the one tree. And so in this world with no uncertainty, the Pigouvian tax is aggregate welfare maximizing, but then a ban is not going to be a Pigouvian tax, but we're going to kind of talk about the producer surplus case. Okay, so let me start out in that first empirical setting in Brazil. We want to show you empirically that producers, agricultural producers, resist environmental regulation. Again, in the setting of the Brazilian Amazon, where this PPCDAM environmental reform increased the enforcement of existing environmental regulations during this period from 2005 to 2011. What are those existing regulations? Well, I'm talking about the Forest Code in Brazil that states, among other things, that on land, even if you own it, privately owned land, if it's in the legal Amazon, must be 80% conserved. Okay, so even if you own the land, you cannot clear cut the whole thing. You need to maintain 80% of your land. And this increased enforcement came with the criminalization as well of deforestation of unclaimed land. So a strengthening of regulation, a strengthening of enforcement. And so we're interested in political resistance, and to get traction on measuring that political resistance, we're going to appeal to campaign donation data. Okay, what are those data? The data come from the Brazilian government. These are data on the universe of campaign donations in Brazil. I want to highlight that this is the universe of formal campaign donations. And so, we're not saying that the informal donations or bribes or corruption are not salient in this setting. We just have no way of getting traction on measuring those. So a sort of more modest statement maybe is that we're going to measure one particular margin of political resistance via these formal donations, and we're going to show you some action there. These campaign donations are for every state and federal election from 2002 to 2018 at the donor level and also at the candidate level. We know both who gave and who received and how much. And we're going to, within this set of donors and within this set of candidates, identify those who are likely to oppose forest regulation, those who are likely to be pro-agriculture, which is this big political divide in Brazil. Because we know which donors and which candidates own themselves agricultural firms, we know that because we have the universe of firm registries also from the Brazilian government. Not only do we know if these donors and candidates own agricultural firms, we also know if they've received any kind of environmental infraction because we also have data on these violations. And so how many data points? Well, for individual donors, we have about 60,000. We also have donors at the level of the firm. We have firm donors, distinct from individual donors, about 30,000. Note that we have about 11,000 candidates here because we also have the state election data. And so we have quite a large number of candidates as well. And within each of these donor classes and candidate class, we have some fraction that are agricultural firm owners or environmental infractions.
And which political level has jurisdiction over these regulations and taxes?
Yeah, absolutely. So the PPCDAM program is a sort of federal program, but there is local enforcement. We should think more about this margin of the kind of federal versus local. Bart Harstad has work about how the level of different externalities and spillovers playing out dictates sort of whether it's optimal to govern at the high level or at the more local level. We're kind of abstracting away from that. So the way we're thinking about it now is sort of just that the data on federal and state elections both are just extra data points. That's the simplistic way we're thinking about it now. I'm kind of pulling it all together. So these are the raw data patterns. This is essentially just a diff and diff. Okay, we are plotting here campaign donations over time. So for donors, we're plotting for you the average donations in dollar values or Brazilian the Brazilian currency values, sort of over time, meaning before the reform versus after the reform, in the agricultural sector versus other sectors. Noting, of course, that this deforestation and this enforcement of forest conservation cuts most deeply for the agricultural sector, which is the sector that is actually deforesting. Okay, so you can think of the agricultural sector as treated and other sectors as untreated in a sort of stylized way. And so this is saying that donors to electoral campaigns from the agricultural sector increased their average donations sort of after relative to before. And the same for candidates. How much do agricultural candidates receive relative to non-agricultural candidates before versus after? And so we'll just run also in regression form the difference in differences before versus after, agriculture versus non-agriculture with the relevant fixed effects and clustering. Okay, but this is just going to be the kind of regression event study form of those diff and diff descriptive plots that I urge. A zeroth stage.
Question about how you're interpreting this. So is it a selections or incentive story from the candidate side? Is it that you're trying to get more candidates in who are sympathetic to your cause, or trying to change the behavior of a set of candidates that are already incumbent and are not supporting you? It maybe doesn't matter very much for the interpretation, but generally we think there are those two different strategies that can be employed.
I agree. We're going to show you results on the vote share and the probability of winning an election that are consistent with the agricultural pro-deforestation candidate is not currently in power, and then I'm going to support them. I'm going to support them with money to get them into power. You could also think that these funds going to candidates are in order to support incumbent agricultural candidates to make sure they stay in power so that they continue to resist the regulation that's been put in place. There's one other thing that may be going on as well that is not quite what we're saying, which is that regulation got put in place right now. It got put in place precisely by the non-agricultural candidates. And so there's also a natural incentive here to actually, maybe I want to support that candidate, so then they owe me something, and therefore, because they owe me something, they're going to change from being non-agricultural to agricultural. We're going to miss that one, but we'll get the other two.
I mean, there are lots of two ways of modeling lobbying with sort of money, and either you try to induce people to, as the Health Fund Grows Fund going on earlier theoretical work on designing policy as a quid pro quo for the donation that you got, or candidates come up with alternatives and you support the one you like the best, and you seem to be leaning towards the latter, and maybe that's contextually plausible, but theoretically they would keep similar results, because of course when you design a platform you anticipate that it will give you some help.
Of course. You also want to...
Yeah, I'm just curious about, I mean, you slightly mentioned, but what was the impetus behind the regulation? Like, who pushed for it? How did it come into being?
My understanding, not being a Brazil expert, is sort of the leftist government was in power, and then they kind of pushed for these deforestation reforms, these conservation reforms. Of course, later Bolsonaro came into power and undid the whole thing. Bolsonaro, is affiliated with this agricultural bancada ruralista, like ruralist bench in Brazil. And so this kind of Bolsonaro not in power, the leftists in power, they put in this environmental regulation, and then there's some backlash at the extreme, putting Bolsonaro in power. And then when Bolsonaro came in power, he kind of undid all of this regulation. That's the sort of campaign donation story that we have in mind. I do think that's a match for the Brazilian.
Do you have any data to show? Because if I'm a farmer in the Amazon and I know that this regulation is going to be put in place, the first thing I do is I burn down the whole forest before like this policy is implemented. Do you see that in your data? Because I feel like there is data on like arson and stuff in the Amazon, and I think it would be really important to have to see if like people have expectations and so they change their behavior just before.
I'm not going to show you anything to that effect today, but the deforestation data are available.
Yeah.
You know, we should check that.
That would be really
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so all this is doing, this is just the event study diff and diff. This is a 0th stage. This is saying after relative to before this PPCDAM reform, the number of infractions issued actually went up. This is just a 0th stage to say that the reform had some bite in terms of regulation. And then from there, this is the event study version of those kind of overtime plots. Agricultural donors relative to non-agricultural donors give more after relative to before. The same for agricultural candidates, they receive it.
Can you remind us what it means that a candidate is agricultural? So he's kind of profession before becoming a mayor.
They're affiliated with an agricultural firm that's registered in the firm registry.
I see. So I mean, before becoming a mayor, he was working in a.
Yeah.
Okay.
You might think that that's a rough cut of being agricultural or not. In some sense, that's going to work against us because we're going to miss a lot of politicians who are actually pro-agriculture, and that's going to inflate our control group. And so in that sense, this is maybe a little. These are the regression estimates in table form, okay, after relative to before, agricultural versus not, more donations that donors are giving, more donations that candidates are receiving. Okay, donations from donors, what donors are giving, the effect is 2,000 something relative to a pre-programmed mean of 1. That's total donations. Okay, so what about within total donations, donations going specifically to agricultural candidates? Here's this 1,000 effect. 1,000 is smaller than 2,000 because it's a subset. Donations top line versus donations just to agricultural candidates. But note that relative to the pre-programmed mean, this effect is about 4 times the pre-programmed mean. The total top line is only 2 times. So not only is there an increase in donations towards, there's not only an increase in donations in general from agricultural donors, this increase in donations is also shifting in composition towards agricultural candidates. It's targeted in that respect. The same from the candidate side. And then related to Tim's question from before about the margin of impact, what's sort of interesting with the state and federal election data is that we can also quantify impacts, again, just by the same difference in different specification on vote counts where we see some effects. At the federal level, kind of vote shares or the number of votes goes up, not necessarily changing in a statistically significant way, whether that agricultural candidate gets elected. But at the state level, maybe a little bit. And then actually in terms of magnitudes, the point estimates are similar. This one is just a bit noisy.
Can you see for who either when the policy was initially implemented or when it was repealed, who voted to move?
Yeah. We should look at that. Because it's related to Ferentz's question, sort of, that's related to the classification of agricultural versus not. If we can get a fine measure of agricultural candidates, then actually maybe this effect is fair.
You have data sets for both them about how they vote in different types of policies, and
For incumbents. So that's the tricky thing. Chico Costa is the Brazilian co-author on this project, and I sort of asked him about whether we could get a more fine measure of agricultural affiliation or not. And it turns out it's kind of not super clear cut. And then actually, now I recall what he said was that the non-incumbents, that's where it becomes very difficult. classified people actually. But maybe we can text analyze their platforms, for example.
Yeah, something else that I've been talking with Costa Chico about potentially doing is there exists, just need to see how to access it, but there is data on the plots of lands owned by people and whether they have had deforestation. A lot of these candidates and donors are landowners. And there are papers who use the identifiable per like farm ownership. So that's another potential avenue to classify agricultural.
Yeah, so that data is actually really good because you can also identify if their deforestation is legal or illegal within the regulation. My other question was, you can also see, I mean, there's kind of a consensus of understanding, I guess, within this, that most of this is driven by small farmers and not large agricultural, corporations that tend to comply a lot better. So maybe something that you could also look at is whether this effect is mostly driven by small scale plots, kind of effect that maybe large scale owners don't really get involved with this kind of issue.
And just remind that you are going to the 2018 election?
Yeah.
So it's after the campaign contribution reforms, right?
It's after, and then there is no effect 2018 for candidates, at least for donors, we see it still a little bit.
So you mentioned that part of the enforcement is local. So that would be even below the district, or at the municipality then, or
State.
Never, yeah, but that's what the data you have, but there's also municipality elections.
We should check. I don't want to overclaim my institutional knowledge of the level of enforcement. There's a national element as well. IBAMA is a sort of national.
But it would be interesting to look at if you could classify agricultural candidate mayors. There are enough municipalities that you can get an RDD to see whether, there's once you get elected, you see an impact on the outcome of conservation that you like.
Yes. Thank you. Wonderful. So this, in a sense, is a kind of rough initial cut to try to establish in the data that producers empirically resist in some form environmental regulation. That sets the stage for where we go now. We're going to argue now with I'll show you now in the next few slides, just a very simple boiled down theoretical model to kind of make the main to make the main point, which is that regulation can perhaps account for these producer losses. So this is going to be a model of forest regulation, a land use model where one develops the land in the sense that one deforests and clear cuts the land, and in doing so emits carbon that is embodied in the trees for agricultural production. And it's going to be a setting where there's spatial heterogeneity in carbon emissions and carbon stocks, because some places are forested and others are not. And in this little example, I'll think about Pigouvian taxes, uniform taxes, and bans. So to set the stage, let's just think about a super stylized boiled down model with plots I of two types, low conservation value and high conservation value. A high conservation value plot has a high value of conservation. It has a large carbon stock, a lot of emissions that outweigh the private profits that one could get from developing the plot to produce agricultural products on. So for simplicity, those private profits are just going to be the same for all plots, but they'll be heterogeneous in those carbon stocks. And so high conservation value plots have high conservation value. They have high, large carbon stocks. Low conservation value plots do not have high conservation value. They have low conservation value and therefore low carbon stocks, low emissions. The social planner would therefore only want to develop L and not H, please.
Sorry, Alan, just missing something. The first part you showed us was basically about opposition to regulation.
Mm-hmm.
How does telling us about the different type of policies speak to that? Because we don't know whether they would oppose taxes bans as well, or.
Absolutely. The short answer is it doesn't. Okay, and then this is part of the kind of structuring of the paper that we're working out now. The ordering of the slides is intended to communicate the following, simply that the Brazilian example motivates producers being sensitive to regulation in some way, where if I really interpret it, agricultural producers have large producer losses from that regulation, and non-agricultural firms do not. And so the Brazilian example is simply meant to evoke this sense of producers being sensitive to producer surplus losses. And if you push on them too hard, they end up resisting politically and overturning the regulation in the first place. With that as a premise, more or less, we're going to think about how different kinds of regulation hit producers harder or not quite as hard. And then we're going to have simulations in the Indonesian context that do this exercise. Let me show you what happens with taxes. Let me show you what happens with bans. But your intuition is right. This is the ordering that we're trying to kind of iron out. Okay, so in this simple setup, plots of type L would be developed, by the social planner, but the social planner would avoid developing on plots H. And so let's first consider Pigouvian taxes that are going to impose those emission damages E on the development of plots. Okay, there's nothing new here. This is to set the stage. But let me note that for plots L, profits are going to fall by the amount of the tax, E. So they're going to fall from pi to pi minus E. So the low conservation value plots, L, are going to lose E. The high conservation value plots, because of the tax, are going to stop developing. The tax is too high relative to their profits, pi. And so the profits are going to fall to 0 because they stop developing. They go from pi to 0, so they lose pi. Let me already note here that pi is less than the emissions by definition. And so actually the good plots L are being penalized proportional to their emissions. The bad plots H are being penalized less than proportional to their emissions already. Now this achieves the first best, but with large losses for producers who are losing E and pi, and we're going to talk about a world, a political world, in which these producer losses are salient for producers, especially if it's the case that the promise of government transfers is not enough to make us trust the government to kind of make us whole after this regulation. Okay, so that's the Pigouvian thing, first best. In terms of aggregate welfare, what about uniform taxes? Well, the simple point here is that a uniform tax cannot achieve the first best. If the uniform tax is high, then nobody develops. If the uniform tax is low, then everybody develops. But recall that the social planner didn't want either everybody or nobody to develop. They only wanted L to develop. And so here the targeting principle applies. The uniform tax is worse at targeting on emissions because it's not taxing by E, it's taxing by a uniform thing. And so we end up with allocative efficiency, okay? The usual intuition. So now, as I talk about bans, there's going to be something a little bit more interesting, which is that with bans, the optimal thing is just to ban development on H, to put an infinite tax on the development of H. But in doing so, you leave plots L alone, and that's kind of the point. Okay, plots L, their profits are still pi, they're left alone, and so they lose 0. Plots H, their profits fall from pi to 0 because they've been banned, so they lose pi. That's no different from the Pigouvian tax. But here, I want to note that the targeting principle applies, but somewhat differently. Even though the ban is worse targeted, is less well targeted on emissions, because again, it's a 0 tax below the cutoff and an infinite tax above the cutoff. Here in this stylized example, I'm not saying this is a general result, there's actually no allocative inefficiency because the ban is able to do exactly what the social planner wanted to do, only let L develop. But the targeting principle still applies here because here the ban is better at targeting on marginality. Plots L are inframarginal, they're left alone. They lose 0 in producer profits, and so the ban is better in the sense that it's better targeted on marginality and better at minimizing producer profit losses. And so if we take this inability to make everyone whole via transfers seriously, then this is a world where maybe bans are good. And again, actually, this targeting principle intuition still carries through in a different way.
So are you assuming that you can observe EI because, or you can classify a plot as L or H from the information set you have? But if you could do, but then if you can do that classification, why can't you just observe EI and get the first best?
Yeah, absolutely. So okay, so there are a few things here. One is I meant to actually update the slides just so this. So thank you for reminding me. The deforestation case is kind of nice because we can see EI, unlike, you set up a factory and I don't really know what the emissions are. Here, EI is presumably observable by the regulator. What is not observable by the regulator is the pi, which is normally pi I. The regulator doesn't know the private profits. And so that's going to be the piece that's tricky. But I agree with you, if the regulator has full information over both EI and pi I, then you just target directly and you're done. Subject to, okay, then you need to target at the plant level and how easy is that to implement and you need to monitor, fine, but.
You can see whether you're an L or an H, that has to be observable, yeah?
Yes.
Otherwise, I can
Yes.
selected that.
Yes.
So you must have some information about pi to know whether you're an L or an H.
E is separate. E is the forest stock. Or E is if you're.
Compare it to something to get whether it's an L or.
Correct. In the quantitative model, we're going to have a structural model that is going to allow us to figure out and back out pi. And that's why we're able to do the simulations. But there's interesting economics here that we haven't fully gone down that path. Conceptually, the regulator needs to elicit pi in some way. Go ahead.
Yeah, so some of our initial motivation in the project is that there seems to be, especially in the context of Indonesia, a lot more spatial heterogeneity in E from where there's peatland and where there's no peatland, which is just an order of magnitude greater than variation in pi. So that point speaks a little bit more to the Weizmann critique. So you can make them very close together in terms of achieving efficiency, the bans and the profits, but that was not the point we wanted to focus on in the little theory example. Was more to show the transfer from producers to the government. Does that answer you?
I'm not sure if this is well formed, but also doesn't the information available to the policymaker change when you cut down the tree? So when you're implementing the ban on deforestation, you can see where the tree is and what plot it's in, whereas once it's been cut down and you're trying to do the taxation on, because you're probably going to levy it on the once it gets somewhere, then you don't know where it came from. It's harder to trace, so your information set is changing.
That's right. That's right. I mean, this kind of where it's a bit tricky is that dynamics enter in here now, because once the trees are cut down, actually it's green now, technically, right? Because the emissions are sunk. And so statically, then it's all well-formed and it's kind of not a problem, but dynamically it's a problem because if I know that I can get greenwashed after I cut, then it's a.
Also just related to the EI thing, I'm just thinking of how should we think about I think one assumption here is that the EI is separable, like for different parts we're thinking about, but I think it's like ecosystem, maybe like adding complementarity and how.
It's separable here.
Yeah.
It's separable here. That's not that crazy. I mean, here are the trees, and then you cut down these trees. This is your peatland. You cut down this peatland. Where are we going to get in trouble? Well, actually, once you start to drain off the peatlands, it gets dry, and then you set your thing on fire, as Robin and Claire and Ben have shown, and then you set everybody's stuff on fire. Okay, then it's a problem, right? So I agree with your intuition. It's separable and observed. Great. So this conversation has kind of previewed this last part. We're going to now move to the Indonesian palm oil context where there's this slash and burn agriculture on peatlands that are extremely carbon rich and highly spatially heterogeneous, and a place where bans are the kind of modal way of approaching regulation here. A ban on deforestation of peatland forest where the peak depth exceeds 3 meters. And so here we benefit from the rich spatial data, plantation acreage, yields, carbon stocks. And so here, we've taken as an opportunity to put together a really boiled down, simple as possible model of land use. This is quite a bit simplified from the dynamic land use model I have in my palm oil paper, for example. So this, I think, is the boiled down version. Plot of land, I, is going to think about the revenues they can get from developing, which are going to be a function of the net present value of prices that they get over time from producing, multiplied by how much they can produce. And then there's going to be a cost structure. And the point of estimation is to estimate this cost structure, to understand how much private costs increase with respect to the carbon stock, i.e. do private firms even care about the carbon stock or not? We're going to find that they don't. That's the negative externality. And then these costs are going to be convex in the sense that the more land you develop within your area, the more the marginal cost goes up, which is going to mean that when we think about the profit function, which is the revenues you get less the costs net of whatever regulation we want to simulate, okay? So our regulation, our tax is going to enter in here, or our ban is going to enter in here to change, to make costs higher in regulated places and lower in unregulated places. Okay, your kind of per hectare of development revenue, less costs, is going to, the product of that is going to be your profits. And the convexity in the costs is going to mean that we get an interior solution. When we take the first order condition and we rearrange, we get this expression, which is an expression for how much development happens. And that's something we see in the satellite data. So N is the number of hectares of plantation development on a plot I, that's data, we see that. We have price data, yields data, we know what region these things are happening in, so we can have region fixed effects and other observables. And then we can run a regression and recover the cost parameter. Okay, but then we need price instruments. Okay, so what's the point of that? Well, now we have a model of how plantation development changes with respect to what? With respect to regulation, which we're going to. Then we know how much land is developed, we know the yields, so we get the quantity supplied, and then for now we just have inelastic demand, and so now we have prices being able to clear the market endogenously. With this simple formulation, actually it turns out that we have this nice, neat expression for producer surplus. In IO, there's this kind of conditional choice probability estimation thing. The intuition there is that the stuff that, in that setting, dynamics, that you want to model and compute, but is complex to model and compute, sit somehow in something that you observe in the data. The choices that people made have within them, embed within them, information about all of their forward-looking expectations. This is the same thing. The intuition here is that the profitability, the producer surplus, is going to be embodied in a decision that we see in the data, which is how much got developed. Okay, if producer surplus were low and not profitable, then you wouldn't see very much development in the data and producer surplus. We get government revenue, domestic welfare, emissions. We can simulate a ban, a zero tax below the cutoff, 3 meters, for example, an infinite tax above the cutoff, and then we can simulate a Pigouvian tax. And this is what we find. The taxes are most efficient in terms of aggregate welfare. Where do you see that here? For any given target level of abatement, here targeting 6 gigatons of emissions reductions, the tax, the Pigouvian tax in blue, is less costly than the ban in red. The blue sits below the red. The 3 meter peak ban is here, and so you see this is kind of a small proportion of the total amount of abatement that is possible in this setting. However, if we look at producer surplus losses, we're going to note that it is now the red that sits below the blue. For a given level, target level of abatement, 6 gigatons of carbon dioxide, the losses to producers are about half what they are under the ban relative to the tax. The producers prefer the ban, and they prefer the ban by a lot. Even though the amount of production, and therefore the amount of emissions, which we can simulate quantitatively, is pretty similar between the two. The red and the blue are not so far apart. You are not losing that much production either way with the tax or the ban, but producers really prefer the ban Now, there's going to be a cost to the ban, which is that the ban raises zero government revenue, whereas the tax raises government revenue. And so this government revenue is why, when you add everything up in aggregate, the tax dominates. But then you need to trust that the salience of the producer losses is taken care of by transfers off of this government revenue. I can say it another way, which is that the tax hits the aggregate first best, the utilitarian first best, by forcing a transfer from producers to the government. A ban avoids that forced transfer. Please.
It's very clever, but there's something that maybe I'm just worrying about nothing, but if you're thinking about the political economy of these types of situations, where there are no workers in your model who are employed in these occupations. So it's really about the people who own the land versus some mythical others, whoever they are, presumably they are workers. But you would have thought a lot of these things have rather profound effects on employment possibilities and wages and things like that. But that seems rather central to some of the political economy of agriculture here. But am I wrong to worry about that, or is it?
No. I think it's
right.
right.
I can't see it.
So there are two ways where workers come in here. One is potentially through consumer surplus as consumers. We've shut that down here because we have perfectly elastic demand, excuse me. Now, the employment can show up on the producer surplus side. And so in this stylized exercise that we're doing now, to the extent that you push down on firms and reduce their profits and leave less profits on the table for them, as the government, you're also pulling down employment. And so that employment effect would be conceptually here. Except that if you think, reasonably so, that this government revenue is, for example, theoretically, redistributed exactly to those workers who lost their jobs, that's going to overturn. Yeah, agreed. And so I think there are a couple of things here. One, we're taking the stance that we're arguing that all of this transfer action is not going to magically make everyone whole. But I agree that we should do a bit more there to make that argument, because in theory it could. Agreed. And then I'll end.
I'm just curious, but there are ways to map some of the predictions of the model into the Brazilian data. For example, whether there's a cross-state variation in the correlation between tax losses and EI, and whether that was corresponding.
That's where we want to go.
Differential backlash.
Yeah, that's where we want to go. As we refine that first section, that's exactly our guiding principle. Thank you. So that's what we have. Environmental regulation induces political resistance. Regulation should think about this political resistance via producer losses with quantitatively important magnitudes in two important contexts around the world. Thank you.